Most folks have never laid eyes on this specific picture. Dodi Fayed is kicked back in a chair, chuckling at something off-camera, looking totally relaxed and full of life. Someone snapped it less than 48 hours before he passed away. People usually focus on her, which totally makes sense. But they rarely bring up him, the guy sitting right there in the passenger seat. His true identity, the reality of his day-to-day existence, and what the formal inquiries finally decided about how everything wrapped up. That is our focus for today. So, who really was Dodi Fayed? Imad Eldin Mohammed Abdel Monim Fayed came into the world on April 15, 1955, in Alexandria, Egypt. The public pretty much just called him Dodi. And to most folks, he was simply known as the kid of Mohammed Al-Fayed, that incredibly wealthy mogul who ran Harrods department store in London and the Hotel Ritz in Paris. The gossip magazines printed that exact narrative of Dodi. The rich party boy, the wealthy heir, the guy who coasted through life relying solely on his dad's cash and reputation. Yet, those who genuinely knew him painted a much more complex picture. Dodi essentially grew up living entirely separated from his dad. His parents split up when he was a kid, so his mother's relatives mostly raised him in Egypt and eventually in Switzerland. His mom, Samira Khashoggi, was the sister of weapons broker Adnan Khashoggi, meaning Dodi stepped right into massive wealth from both branches of his family tree. Growing up like that leaves a heavy mark. It can make a guy feel like he is constantly stuck standing right in the doorway of somebody else's room. He went to the elite Sandhurst Military Academy in England, which preps British Army officers. However, he ended up dropping out before finishing the whole course. He also took a few classes over at the London Film School. It is incredibly easy to skip past these facts, but they matter because they show a guy who was honestly searching for his true calling, rather than just drifting along. He landed in London in the mid-1970s and naturally gravitated straight toward the movie business. People usually skip over this chapter, but it is totally fascinating. Dodi was not just a quiet investor tossing cash at movies to seem cool. He truly worked. He was an executive producer on the 1981 flick Chariots of Fire, which ended up taking home the Oscar for Best Picture. He stayed involved in other film projects throughout the 1980s and 1990s, like FX in 1986 and Hook in 1991. That massive Spielberg flick starring Robin Williams. The crews on those sets remembered him as highly eager, occasionally scattered, but completely obsessed with good storytelling. According to these stories, he possessed a real warmth that totally contradicted his media persona. He was a guy who remembered birthdays, who returned calls, and got fired up about concepts in a way that felt entirely real instead of performed. He also maintained a highly publicized romantic life. He went out with several famous women over the years, like big-name actresses and models who dominated the tabloids throughout the 1980s. In 1986, he wed a model named Suzanne Gregard. That marriage survived a mere 8 months. Following the split, he stayed single for the rest of his life, though the tabloids constantly claimed he was always on the verge of popping the question. By the summer of 1997, Dodi Fayed had just turned 42. He was splitting his time between London and Los Angeles, grinding away on movie deals, and had lately gotten pretty tight with a woman whose sheer fame would shove them both into a totally unbelievable, chaotic media spotlight. Her name, of course, was Diana. The summer of 1997, the romance between Dodi Fayed and Diana, Princess of Wales, heated up in the summer of 1997. Though they had actually crossed paths years prior at a polo game. Mohammed Al-Fayed, who was Dodi's dad, had been tight with Diana's family for ages. So he invited Diana and her boys, William and Harry, to tag along on a Fayed family getaway to the south of France in early July 1997. People framed it as a super laid-back, friendly vacation, a perfect chance for the boys to enjoy summer break far away from the relentless paparazzi that constantly hounded Diana. What went down over those weeks became one of the most heavily snapped and obsessively gossiped about romances of the entire decade. Paparazzi constantly captured shots of Diana and Dodi, chilling on yachts, hitting the beach, and visiting Mediterranean ports. Those pictures sold for absolutely insane cash. Every major gossip paper in Britain, France, and across the globe tracked their every step. Publishers were shelling out big bucks that were considered totally nuts, even for 1990s tabloid standards. The British gossip rags had obsessively trailed Diana since she first stepped into the limelight back in the early 1980s. For 16 years, the media monitored every aspect of her matrimony, hardships, philanthropic work, social circles, and romances. Heading into the summer of 1997, the public's craving for her pictures remained completely insatiable. In reality, the obsession only intensified. Recently divorced, she completely revamped her public persona. Reporters and everyday folks alike considered her to be the single most captivating human being across the entire globe. Suddenly, rumors swirled that she caught feelings for a new man. Everyone debated the actual depth of this newfound romance, arguing whether it was just a quick seasonal fling or a profound connection, fueling massive tabloid speculation. Her inner circle shared conflicting stories, while his confidants offered entirely contrasting narratives to various reporters. A close confidant remarked that the royal seemed more authentically joyful than she had been in over a decade. Several pals remained hesitant, claiming the connection felt too fresh to judge. However, the concrete facts are clear. During August 1997, the couple enjoyed extensive getaways together during several different international vacations. Snapshots of the duo erased any doubts that they were just platonic pals. And by the final days of August, the pair touched down in the French capital. Rumors also circulated, featuring unconfirmed and highly debated claims that he bought jewelry from Rapazzi, a high-end boutique situated around the famous plaza. Media outlets heavily branded this specific piece of jewelry as a definitive marriage token, even though its true meaning and the existence of any actual wedding preparations were never definitively proven by anyone. UK investigators listened to statements from boutique owners and hotel employees, revealing a remarkably unclear and confusing overall narrative, hinting at a deeply committed partnership, while failing to provide concrete evidence of an actual marriage offer. One undeniable certainty remains regarding the nighttime hours of August 30th, 1997, when the couple dined inside the Ritz Paris, an upscale property belonging to his dad, before figuring out their next move for the evening. That specific choice forever altered history, linking the lodging, the photographers, and their fateful strategy. During August 1997, the famous Parisian venue offered zero privacy or stealth for someone as wildly famous as the People's Princess. Back then, she undeniably held the title of the most heavily documented female face worldwide. The legal split from her royal ex-husband concluded 12 months prior, and she subsequently retreated from numerous strict palace obligations. Her explosive television sit-down recently sent absolute shockwaves throughout the elite UK monarchy. Plus, she spent her warm weather months alongside a companion, whom tabloids swiftly labeled as her new steady partner. Following an Italian getaway, the famous pair landed in France on August 30th, booking the lavish Imperial Suite. Just a few hours before that, the famous duo toured Villa Windsor, the sprawling historic estate housing former exiled royals after they abdicated, which his wealthy father recently purchased and entirely restored. Employees noticed their walkthrough, which newspapers eventually framed as a massively important turning point. Although nobody ever confirmed if the partners actually shared any deep or important conversations inside. The couple eventually ate their nighttime meal privately upstairs, ditching the public dining hall due to massive external swarms and relentless scrutiny. Employees remembered the supper feeling incredibly laid back. Both lingered indoors for quite a while. Bystanders recalled the sheer volume of aggressive shutterbugs swarming the perimeter as completely suffocating. Huge packs of eager cameramen clustered around the famous square, waiting. A few stalked the entrance all afternoon. The sheer chaotic magnitude of revving bikes, flashing lenses, and aggressive shoving, once rumors leaked that they were inside, felt way more like an outright military blockade than basic journalism. Initially, the famous duo intended to exit the premises and head straight toward his private luxury flat situated right near the famous City Arch. That journey meant a fairly brief cruise across town. Yet as midnight approached and the massive mob of picture hunters refused to pack up, security hatched an alternate escape route involving a clever diversion. They would launch a pair of dummy cars out front to distract the media. Simultaneously, the high-profile lovers planned to sneak out via a hidden back alleyway and jump directly inside an entirely different ride. Their chosen getaway vehicle was a dark Mercedes S280. A local driver took the helm. That man was Henri Paul. At this exact juncture, the narrative morphed into a massive puzzle that detectives, reporters, and lawyers spent decades deciphering. The driver was exactly 40. The guy normally worked as second in command for the hotel's protection detail, but stepped up as the interim chief back in June 1997. Co-workers frequently remembered the guy as highly capable, dedicated, and incredibly popular. After clocking in at the property for ages, management viewed him as an insider who profoundly understood the building, its elite clientele, and daily operations. By no stretch of the imagination was he an actual driver. He handled the safety protocols rather than chauffeuring VIPs. Everyone who knew him agreed that he really valued his profession. Coworkers called him highly detail-oriented and great at keeping secrets. Exactly the sort of guy who knew that a place like the Ritz demanded an elite level of total discretion. The man could fly personal planes and converse fluently in several different tongues. Clearly, he had carefully crafted a solid professional reputation over the years. Plus, Henri Paul wasn't even supposed to be on the clock that night of August 30th. His shift had already ended, so he had headed out from the building a few hours prior. They phoned him to come back while throwing together a scheme involving a fake-out car at the back door. He headed over and said yes to getting behind the wheel. Exactly what went into Henri Paul's system from the minute he clocked out until he sat in the driver's seat of that Mercedes turned into a huge focal point for all the later probes. The formal French autopsy lab results showed that his blood alcohol concentration during the accident sat at roughly triple the lawful driving limit over in France. Investigators also discovered lingering remnants of pharmacy pills in his system, namely a mix of pharmaceuticals meant to manage panic attacks, along with treatments for severe drinking habits. People instantly started pushing back hard against these claims. His relatives, alongside a few outside specialists, heavily doubted the exact methods the lab used to gather and analyze the fluids. Serious worries popped up regarding potential mix-ups with the vials or if the evidence got tainted somehow. Arguing about those lab numbers briefly turned into an incredibly dense scientific battle within the whole case, dragging in medical examiners, hematologists, and crime lab researchers who constantly bumped heads. Authorities demanded a totally separate test. Everything matched up perfectly with the original data. As for the formal probes, including the initial French look and that later British court hearing wrapping up in 2008, everyone agreed that Henri Paul was heavily intoxicated before ever stepping foot into the vehicle. Yet this is exactly why wrapping the case up nicely proved so incredibly difficult. Bystanders hanging around the Ritz earlier that night offered completely wildly different stories about how he looked right before taking off. A few claimed he acted totally fine. Others swore he threw back some booze, while a third group noticed absolutely zero red flags. One server who waited on him remembered the guy looking super calm. A different worker mentioned spotting nothing out of the ordinary. Surveillance cameras mounted around the hotel caught Henri Paul chatting, strolling about, and carrying himself in a manner that experts totally disagreed on. Certain professionals watching the tape claimed his body language definitely suggested heavy drinking. Meanwhile, others argued you just couldn't make a solid call based strictly on the video. Figuring out if he actually looked drunk and whether somebody should have stepped in shadowed the entire inquiry for decades. Then you have to factor in how fast they went and the underpass itself. Driving from the Ritz over at Place Vendôme straight to Dodi's apartment, right by the Arc de Triomphe, really wasn't a huge trip. On an average day, you'd make it in about 10 to 15 minutes, depending on the gridlock. They took a path hugging the right side of the Seine River, pushing west. That specific drive takes you right into the Pont de l'Alma underpass. It dips below the Place de l'Alma and essentially tracks the water. Compared to your average city highway, the Alma Tunnel really isn't considered a tricky or deadly spot to navigate. The road just bends a tiny bit as it cuts underneath the square. Back when the wreck happened, cars were only allowed to go 50 kilometers an hour, which sits around 31 miles per hour. Detectives eventually figured out that the sedan blasted into the dark opening doing anywhere from 90 to 120 kilometers per hour. A few studies hinted the vehicle might have actually topped those speeds momentarily. Down in the darkness, the luxury ride clipped a white Fiat Uno. Exactly how they hit, whether they smashed head-on, traded paint, or just barely dodged each other before Henri wiped out, sparked one of the fiercest arguments in the whole case. That little white car just kept on rolling. Nobody ever pinned down the exact vehicle, and the person behind the wheel vanished forever, even after Europe threw everything they had into finding that specific ride. Right after bumping the smaller car, the big sedan slammed directly into the 13th column holding up the roof. The smash was utterly devastating. It sent the vehicle spinning around until it stopped completely backward. The clock read right around 12:23 in the morning on August 31st, 1997, marking the very beginning of the fallout. Paramedics and cops weren't the first ones pulling up to the wreckage. It was a pack of paparazzi. Just moments after the collision, a handful of photographers tailing the Mercedes on motorbikes pulled up to the wreckage. That specific detail sparked intense debate in the aftermath. Pictures were snapped right away in the underpass following the wreck. A few of these shots made it to print, while a judge blocked others from seeing the light of day. Hearings brought up whether the press blocked early paramedics from helping the injured, though nobody ever reached a clear conclusion. Somebody navigating the underpass during the collision eventually testified regarding their observations right after the vehicle struck the pillar. They mentioned spotting the automobile blocking the lanes, with steam and exhaust billowing into the air, while individuals, including several holding cameras, instantly swarmed the disaster site. This bystander recalled attempting to assist, but struggling to access the automobile due to the crowd already crowding it. First responders from Paris eventually showed up, discovering 4 individuals inside the car. Sitting up front was Trevor Rees-Jones, a security detail working for the Fayed household. Though gravely wounded, he survived thanks to his shoulder strap. The man behind the wheel, Henri Paul, passed away instantly. Emergency crews discovered Dodi Fayed and Diana clinging to life in the rear passenger area. Dodi suffered fatal trauma from the collision and passed away before leaving the site. Diana remained alive. The subsequent hours saw local medics making crucial choices regarding her treatment, the path chosen for the ambulance, and the delays before reaching the operating room. All these factors sparked intense debate and faced heavy review during United Kingdom hearings over 10 years down the line. Back then, Paris healthcare workers handled urgent injuries completely differently than their English counterparts. French protocols heavily favored getting victims medically steady right there before moving them. Meanwhile, the United Kingdom focused on rushing patients straight to the emergency room, often referred to as a scoop-and-run method. Medics held Diana at the wreckage for extensive care before transferring her to the Pitié-Salpêtrière Medical Center, sitting roughly 6 kilometers from the crash site. Driving slowly to prevent worsening her condition dragged the trip out even longer. Upon reaching the facility, doctors rushed her straight into the operating room. Her chest trauma involved the pulmonary vein, which is responsible for moving fresh blood directly into the heart. That specific wound is incredibly deadly, no matter the situation. Yet surgeons fought to save her for hours. By 4 o'clock in the morning on August 31st, 1997, officials declared Diana, Princess of Wales, deceased. Dodi Fayed passed away at 42, while Diana was 36. Here is what the Parisian inquiry ultimately determined. Local authorities looked into the accident for about 3 years. Magistrate Hervé Stéphane spearheaded the probe, officially categorized as a manslaughter case. They mainly focused on figuring out if Henri Paul was dangerously intoxicated while behind the wheel, alongside reviewing how the trailing paparazzi acted. Detectives gathered statements from hundreds of bystanders during the process. Officials scrutinized debris from the wreck, the car itself, the underpass, and nearby avenues. They also poured massive manpower into tracking down that infamous white Fiat Uno. By September 1999, Magistrate Stefan wrapped up the inquiry, dropping all criminal allegations against the press tailing the ride. The official ruled that although reporters were actively chasing the automobile, nothing proved their actions forced the driver to speed so recklessly, nor could anyone legally confirm they blocked medics from doing their jobs. Ultimately, Paris officials blamed the fatal wreck on Henri Paul being under the influence and stepping too hard on the gas. Investigators pointed to that white Fiat Uno as a major piece of the puzzle, since Paul seemingly swerved to avoid it underground. However, nobody ever tracked down the owner. Many suspected the vehicle belonged to James Anderson, a local paparazzo hanging around town that same night. And Anderson passed away in May 2000. With local cops officially labeling his demise as a suicide. Yet that ruling sparked massive debate among skeptics convinced he was actually murdered. Damage found on his car definitely matched the kind of scrapes you would see from a recent wreck, yet detectives insisted it was not enough to prove it was the exact automobile from the underpass. Dodi's dad, Mohammed Al-Fayed, completely refused to accept any of the Parisian findings. From the very beginning, he fiercely argued that the couple was murdered, and the crash was absolutely no mistake. The core convictions held by Mohammed Al-Fayed, everyone agreed that the billionaire was completely shattered by his boy's passing. The man had to bury his own flesh and blood. Their father-son bond had definitely been messy for decades, largely because the younger man spent his entire existence trying to find his footing under the massive weight of his dad's fortune and fame. Still, that was his boy. During the weeks, and eventually the decades following that fatal collision, the grieving father evolved into the loudest, most relentless advocate, insisting that the tragedy inside that Parisian underpass was absolutely intentional. His main argument hinged on the idea that the couple was murdered to stop their upcoming wedding, as well as to hide the fact that the princess was pregnant with his baby. He firmly suspected the UK's ruling elite, particularly shadowy figures tied to the monarchy, orchestrated their assassination to put an end to the engagement and stop the arrival of a baby with an Egyptian Muslim dad. The tycoon broadcast these accusations to the entire world over and over again, never backing down. He called out specific people by name. He highlighted exact clues that he felt proved his theory, even putting his own team of private detectives on the payroll. He sat down with lawmakers and spent years lobbying hard for a comprehensive national investigation in the UK. Ultimately, he won that battle. The official UK probe, which was officially called the Inquests into the Passing of the Princess of Wales and Imad el-Din Mohammed Abdelmonem Fayed, kicked off in October 2007 and wrapped up in April 2008. Lord Justice Scott Baker ran the proceedings, listening to statements from upward of 250 people over the course of a half year. That undertaking went down as one of the most drawn-out and costly legal reviews the United Kingdom had ever seen. On April 7, 2008, the panel delivered a ruling of unlawful death, though it completely missed the mark of what the billionaire was pushing for. Here is what the investigation uncovered. The panel ultimately decided that the famous pair lost their lives unjustly due to the incredibly reckless handling of the wheel by Henri Paul, combined with the equally dangerous maneuvers of the cars chasing them. Those trailing cars were driven by the paparazzi tailing the couple across the French capital that evening. This final judgment completely dismissed the grieving father's assassination theories. The jurors saw absolutely zero proof of a secret scheme, nor did they uncover any hints of a fake collision or intentional foul play. Instead, they landed on a reality that was arguably even harder to swallow. A pair of individuals perished simply because a guy who had no business being behind the wheel was speeding carelessly through a concrete underpass late at night, chased by a swarm of paparazzi who were also swerving like maniacs just to get a snapshot. The official hearings dug incredibly deep into every single wild accusation the Egyptian magnate had ever floated. They looked into rumors of a baby on the way, the supposedly purchased diamond, whispers about British intelligence pulling strings, the chauffeur's exact timeline, and whoever he might have been talking to, as well as how the paparazzi acted and the emergency care the royal was given at the scene. Regarding the maternity rumors, medical examiners confirmed there was zero physical proof that she was expecting a child when she passed away. As for the jewelry, the court listened to the jeweler, Rapassi, but the story that came out was pretty murky. While facts showed the billionaire's son liked a specific piece and had it sent to the hotel, nothing actually proved he had popped the question. When it came to the Secret Service potentially having a hand in things, spies themselves took the stand under oath, and the panel reviewed a massive stack of classified documents. In the end, the ruling found no truth to the idea that government operatives set up or played a role in the fatal wreck. But honestly, and you really have to pause on this, the hearings also painted a picture of absolute pandemonium and mixed signals, defining that entire evening, creating a mess so bizarre, it's hard to view it as just a regular date night. Using a fake-out car, swapping the chauffeur right at the end, the weird path they drove, the sheer velocity, the underpass, the swarming cameras. Basically, the whole ordeal was just a domino effect of tiny choices, all of which kind of made sense in the moment, yet piled up to create an absolute nightmare. Then there is Trevor Rees-Jones and the safety restraint issue. Honestly, it is the one piece of trivia from that tragedy that haunts you forever. Out of the 4 passengers sitting inside that Mercedes S280 late on August 30th, 1997, just a single person had buckled up. The security detail riding shotgun walked away with his life. The driver, the boyfriend, and the beloved royal never bothered to click theirs in, and all 3 of them died. Even so, the surviving guard was so horribly banged up that surgeons had to completely rebuild his face. His jawline, cheekbones, and the rest of his skull took such a massive beating that it took countless procedures and a really long time to put him back together. Discussing what he went through happens almost never, and it clearly brings him immense pain. According to his own accounts, everything that occurred in that underpass is completely blank. His mind goes blank prior to the wreck, only picking back up after waking up in the medical center. When his memoir dropped in 2000, readers reacted with both compassion and heavy skepticism. Some critics figured he withheld details. Plenty of folks believed he truly shared all he could, thinking the severe injuries and shock wiped out the exact details society craved the most. Science clearly shows that massive head injuries can completely wipe a person's recollection. During massive collisions, the human mind occasionally just stops saving new information. Rees-Jones's testimony perfectly matched this exact medical phenomenon. Yet for anyone aching to know how those last moments unfolded in that passageway, his inability to speak on it felt truly agonizing. Authorities from France looked into the safety harness issue, and the UK inquiry dug into it once more later on. During the hearings, witnesses testified regarding how lax the Fayed protection detail was regarding buckling up in their fleet. Officials confirmed nobody really made sure passengers were clicking those straps in. That tiny piece of information, so frustratingly basic, keeps drawing detectives, reporters, and everyday citizens back down the rabbit hole decade after decade, not to solve some massive conspiracy, but rather to highlight just how incredibly vulnerable and terrifyingly real the tragedy truly ended up being. This goes way beyond textbook lore. We're talking about an automobile, an underpass, and 4 actual people. Moving on to Dodi's dad and the following decades. Mohammed Al-Fayed completely rejected what both the Parisian cops and the English courts declared. He kept telling anyone who would listen that his boy was assassinated. Bankrolling private probes into the wreck became his ongoing mission. Furthermore, he carefully maintained that tribute dedicated to Dodi and Diana set up right inside his famous Harrods department store, an installation that stood for ages as arguably the most talked about and heavily viewed attraction sitting inside a global shopping center. Visitors could view pictures of the couple alongside objects tied to that highly rumored marriage proposal band, plus a gold-colored geometric shrine honoring their lives. A grieving dad built this incredibly intimate landmark, convinced that mourning openly meant pointing fingers openly too. By 2010, Mohammed Al Fayed handed Harrods over to the Qatar Investment Authority. Taking down the tribute was simply factored into the buyout. Sitting down with reporters to discuss losing his boy remained a constant for him later on. His core narrative stayed entirely unshaken. When August 2023 rolled around, Mohammed Al Fayed passed away at 94 years old. Shortly after his funeral, numerous females stepped out of the shadows, sharing stories of alleged predatory behavior tied to the billionaire, spanning multiple eras. These accusations carried heavy weight, piled up quickly, and covered quite an extensive timeline. Top media outlets ran the stories, causing everyone to completely rethink the billionaire's reputation. All this background info only really ties back into Dodi Fayed's passing through a single lens. It throws another curveball into the messy life story of a guy who spent upwards of 25 years serving as the loudest, most prominent voice claiming his kid suffered a hit job. Dodi never faced any ties to those specific assault claims. However, the patriarch who dedicated half his life defending his boy's honor morphed into an incredibly controversial character after kicking the bucket. Looking at the Pont de l'Alma underpass right now, it still stands in Paris. Commuters cruise down that road daily. Sitting right above the opening on the street level sits a golden torch. The United States originally gifted this Statue of Liberty replica to the French to represent their solid alliance. Crews put it up long before the accident ever happened, meant purely as a celebration of the bond between America and France. Yet during the aftermath of August 31st, 1997, locals started dropping off bouquets, snapshots, and letters right around its pedestal. Without any government approval, the public essentially turned that torch into Princess Diana's makeshift shrine. That vibe remains today. Sightseers show up constantly, and fresh blooms keep appearing. Meanwhile, Dodi gets zero formal recognition around the area. You will not find any bronze sign for him. Even after passing, he basically stayed riding shotgun. Here is the reality the clues point toward. Over 30 years of deep dives, countless interviews, massive stacks of paperwork, and an incredibly lengthy UK courtroom review, the final narrative boils down to this reality. Late on the night of August 30th, 1997, an unfit chauffeur got behind the wheel of a Parisian vehicle, pushing the speedometer way past anything remotely safe for those city streets. Things went sideways in that underpass. Maybe they clipped another ride. Maybe they barely dodged one. But whatever went down completely threw the steering off. The sedan smashed into a pillar, claiming 3 lives. Paparazzi tailing the ride absolutely added to the chaos that ultimately sparked the deadly chain reaction. Nobody riding in that cabin had their straps clicked in. Their path was mapped out, completely rushed, desperately trying to shake the exact same tabloids who stayed glued to their bumper anyway. There was no massive cover-up, shadowy hit, or planned sabotage. It ultimately came down to an intoxicated driver, a speeding vehicle, and an underpass. Occupying the front passenger spot sat Dodi Fayed, an individual perpetually eclipsed by his dad's towering legacy. Yet during his final days, he finally stumbled upon a profound sense of authentic joy. And the 42-year-old possessed absolutely zero clue that the evening of August 30th would unfold differently than any prior evening. Official inquiries wrapped up, and jurors delivered their findings. Today's lingering doubts rarely center around the actual events themselves. Instead, folks wonder about the mechanics of the tragedy and those fatal choices leading up to it, alongside the unchecked environment and intense stress forcing those 4 individuals into that specific automobile that evening. We should pause to reflect on this, since the hardest part of this tragedy's conclusion isn't some deep enigma. Rather, the true heartbreak lies in its absolute predictability. A basic chain of commonplace blunders, an unfit chauffeur taking the wheel, a carelessly rushed path, an underpass where velocity restrictions were completely ignored, all culminating in a horrific outcome that society still finds hard to swallow almost 30 years later. As for Dodi Fayed's memory, society generally only recalls his existence through his tragic connection with the princess. He is forever linked to her in conversation, and his passing is merely framed as a byproduct of hers.
Honestly, that makes perfect sense and isn't completely unjustified either.
Their bond was genuine, concluding identically at the exact same split second. Yet this guy lived a full 42 years prior to entering that underpass, producing movies, building deep friendships, navigating messy family dynamics. He legitimately carved out his own distinct, complex path. He wasn't merely playing second fiddle in another person's epic biography. Even following his passing, his film studio, Allied Stars, kept the lights on for quite a while. Nobody can erase his proven involvement with Chariots of Fire. That movie stands as a monumental 20th century British masterpiece, proudly displaying his on-screen credit. Entertainment industry colleagues consistently looked back on his presence fondly, although they recognized he was still struggling to forge a personal identity completely detached from his dad's massive empire. A profound, subtle heartbreak exists within. The reality of a guy fighting for decades to escape a massive fortune's shadow, only to have his entire legacy cemented by his final driving companion, rather than his own achievements. Hollywood buddies of his constantly share media anecdotes painting him as an incredibly lavish giver whose passion for cinema sprang from sheer authenticity, never just chasing trendy vibes. And he possessed a very special soft spot for folks grinding at the bottom of the set hierarchy, the grips and runners that rich executives typically treat like complete ghosts. Those little traits never sell papers, as they almost never do. We'll never know the man Dodi Fayed was evolving into during the summer of 1997, if he had finally hit a major turning point in life, or if his romance with the princess was truly endgame. The truth behind the engagement jewelry, their future goals, and what could have been, will forever remain unsolved. We do know for sure he existed, breathed, and carried his own unique baggage. You can even catch his genuine chuckle in candid pictures, smiling at off-camera moments right up until the 31st of August, 1997, when his journey abruptly halted in a Parisian underpass. Today, the Pont de l'Alma thoroughfare is significantly broader than it was back then. Crews shifted the interior support columns around and completely repainted all the traffic lines.
The entire scene bears little resemblance to that fateful evening, yet the memorial fire topside refuses to ever go out. Meanwhile, our burning curiosities, ignoring all the crazy tinfoil hat rumors,
center on the deeply relatable tragedy of how such disasters unfold, the tiny choices triggering point-of-no-return events, and individuals ultimately downgraded to mere background characters in their personal biographies. These kinds of thoughts never truly vanish. They merely fade into a whisper over the decades. Dodi Fayed simply happened to be the guy riding shotgun. He wasn't behind the wheel. He didn't pick the path. He wasn't the one calling the shots during those last ticking seconds. He was merely present. Until he suddenly vanished. Hey, if this content hooked you, smash that like button and subscribe to ensure you catch all our upcoming deep dives into incredible history.